Hi, I'm Pat Iyer, and this is Legal Nurse Podcast. I want to welcome you to the show, our weekly podcast directed to legal nurse consultants around the world. As of the time I'm doing this recording, we have listeners in about 95 countries. And it pleases me so much that you have found this program to be useful. I'd like you to do me a favor. This is the first time I'm asking for this. I'd like to know where you are listening to this podcast. Send me a picture to Pat Iyer at legalnursebusiness.com. Some people listen on walks, some people listen in the gym, some people listen while they are walking around their house. I'm curious about where you're listening. And I'll share those pictures on my website. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jean Cooper, who is participating in this program in Arizona. I'm sitting in Florida. Jean is a new member of LNC Elite, which is my coaching program, and she just joined a few days ago, having upgraded her membership from LNC Success Connection. And it is such a pleasure to have her in the group. Jean has a background working in the Veterans Administration system for many years. And after leaving that system, she began working with a medical malpractice defense attorney. She has earned her LNCC, which is the certification that is granted by the American Association of Legal Nurse Consultants through their certification board. And she practices independently with attorneys handling cases in medical malpractice, personal injury, and criminal defense. Our topic today is the criminal defense side of cases. This is Jean's passion. Jean, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
When we were talking and getting ready for the show today, Jean, you spoke to me about helping to gain release from prison for a woman who was accused of murdering her child. And I'd love for you to tell our listener who's listening to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms, or watching it on Legal Nurse Business YouTube channel, where we present the video podcast. Tell our viewer or listener what happened in this case.
Well, it was very interesting. I originally got involved in the case when the attorney called me in 2017. And it was a post-conviction relief case. So what that means is that someone who has been convicted of a wrongdoing, of a felony, and is in serving a prison sentence, it could be a long period of time, a life sentence, it could be like on death row, it could be a multitude of things, but that person is serving a sentence in prison. They petition to the court for post-conviction, after their conviction, relief of whatever their sentence is. So that's how I got involved, that the attorney was assigned by the court to this case. So I want to tell you a little bit about this case. It was fascinating. And so our client, by the time I got involved, our client was in prison for about 11 years. It took us another 3 years from the time that I first got involved to resolve our case. It was fascinating. So to start with, our client, when she was 19 years old, she is an African-American single mom living in an apartment with her 2 children, Lucy, who was 2 years old, and Lily, who was 10 months old. Also in that apartment was her mother, her aunt, and her 2 younger sisters. it was a group of wonderful people who were extremely naive and unsophisticated. So Lily worked part-time doing clerical duties in a physician's office. She also was a part-time college student, but she was a single mom here in Arizona. She did not have health insurance through her employer, so she was enrolled in the Arizona's Medicaid or public health program, which is called Access here. She did use Access, and she used the WIC program, which is a nutritional program for women, infants, and children under the umbrella of Access. So she got foodstuff and formula for her children. So her older daughter, the 2-year-old Lucy, was normal, active, interacting, crazy 2-year-old and was very healthy. Lily was born in April 2003, and the medical records indicated that she was that the pregnancy was normal. Lily was born at 38 weeks gestation. There were no issues except that mom was slightly anemic. She has chronic anemia now. And otherwise things seemed to be okay. So she had a vaginal delivery, and it was documented as uneventful. However, looking at the birth record, the amniotic fluid was meconium stained. And when they were, how they resuscitate a baby and after they're born, even though they don't, that's called resuscitation, but they, warm them up and look at them, measure them, make sure that they're breathing sufficiently. And they suctioned some meconium out of her mouth. And the record, it says out of her stomach, but I have a feeling they didn't put a tube in her stomach. They just took it out of her mouth. So that's one issue that we needed to look at. She weighed 6 pounds and 9 ounces, which is small, but it's still nearly within a normal range for an infant girl. They stayed in the hospital for 24 hours, and then they were discharged to home. And our client's name was Susan. I think I forgot to say that. She took Lily to her 3-month appointment, her well baby appointment, and the provider at the well baby appointment documented that the child was normal. There was nothing out of the ordinary except that she was small. And at that time said the documentation showed that she was meeting her developmental goals at 3 months. And I'm sorry, for our conversation, I did not write the weight down, but she was still small within normal parameters. Her head was normal size, her length was small, but still within normal parameters. So then in October of 2003, Lily was now 10 months old. She developed a cough and chest congestion and a fever. So Susan took her to an emergency room. The emergency room doctor documented that Lily was well hydrated, non-toxic appearing. That's pretty subjective, and was alert, interactive, and appropriate for a 10-month-old. The blood and urine samples were taken, and the physician documented that Lily had a viral syndrome, an upper respiratory infection, and he prescribed decongestant and Tylenol for pain and fever. He did not document the large amount of ketones in Lily's urine that day, nor did he mention that she was underweight. The weight was documented as 11 pounds. By this time, 10 months old, Lily should have been closer to 16 pounds. So they went home, and then in February of 2004, Lily developed a cough and runny nose and chest congestion again. And Susan was home one day in February 15th, was home alone with Lily. And so Lily slept late that day. Susan had to wake her up at about 11:30. She felt that she needed to give her a bottle because she had been sleeping all night. One of the other issues that I forgot to tell you, I think I was going to tell you later, but Lily was not normal. She was not crawling. She was not engaging with her environment. She did not grasp for a bottle like when she was being fed. You know how a baby holds a bottle. She did not do that. She did not feed herself, and she did not sit up on her own. She definitely did not stand up. Even when she was held in a standing position, Susan told me later that she grimaced. None of this was in the medical records. It was all through interviewing Susan that we found this information out. So that's a big deal to the case. So Susan gives Lily her bottle at about 11:30 and put her back down to sleep. Lily had been sleeping with her sister in a youth bed, and the mattress was between 10 and 14 inches off the floor, and the floor was wall-to-wall carpeting. So about 1 o'clock, Susan went into the room to check on Lily, and she found her face down on the carpet and unresponsive. So she called 911 and started doing what she called CPR. I'm not really sure what her maneuvers were. Now, we need to remember that Lily was not crawling. It's hard to know if she was even rolling over, but one of the questions that the legal team asked was, how did she end up on the floor if she's not crawling? So the EMS showed up probably by the time the EMS, the medical emergency technicians showed up. It was at least 20 minutes from the time that Susan found Lily and they showed up. So basically she was without oxygen or not breathing for that entire time. So they took over and they put an IV, they put access into her shin bone, and then they also intubated her, put a tube in her throat into her lungs to oxygenate her by bagging with oxygen, and quickly loaded her and took her before they loaded her, when they monitored her, she had no pulse besides no breathing. So they gave her 1 dose of epinephrine, and that established a heartbeat. So they quickly packed her up and loaded her and took her to the local, to Phoenix's Children's Specialty Hospital. So when she was being admitted into the ER for assessment, a nurse was overheard saying that that baby had been, what did she say? She beat the hell out of that baby. EMS had documented that the child was flaccid, that means no movement, and not stiff, floppy, and had bruises around her body. The injury diagram that's typically completed in the ER showed bruising all over her body, her head, her back, her chest, and her legs. I don't remember documentation about bruises on her arms. So the diagnosis, so the working diagnosis for her was upper respiratory infection, failure to thrive, and abusive head injury, AHT. So they did continue doing resuscitative things. They sent her for imaging. Of course, they took a chest x-ray and saw evidence of pneumonia. They did a CT, a scan of her head that showed a subarachnoid bleed and swelling. They did skeletal films, so x-rays of all the bones of the body, which is a routine when someone is assumed to have been abused, when a child is assumed to have been abused. And they found no broken no broken bones in the body. And on the head CT, they also mentioned that there were no skull fractures. And that was kind of a big deal because in the emergency room, or when someone is so critical, I'm not sure, I don't remember the exact point that the pediatric neurosurgeon was involved, but she was finally admitted to the pediatric ICU. So the neurosurgeon examined her and looked at the imaging, and he concluded that there was a fracture in the base of the skull. Now, the radiologist had said there were no fractures in the skull. There was a widened suture, which is the space between the bones of the skull that could widen if the brain was swelling. The brain was swelling. So the neurosurgeon documented that there was a skull fracture. So Lily did not respond. She continued to be flaccid, unresponsive, and they did some EEGs or electroencephalograms to look at her brain activity to see if there was any, and there was no brain activity. So after 2 days of care in the ICU, Lily was pronounced dead. One of the things in Arizona, when a child is found unresponsive and 911 is called, a police detective is also notified to go to the scene. So there was a detective that came to Susan's house and was basically on the scene about the same time as EMS. So he was at the hospital at the same time that EMS was. So when Lily got there, EMS was there, the nurses and doctors in the emergency room, and the police detective. They all interacted and they came up with their diagnosis. And the detective had input into the development of diagnosis, especially of abusive head trauma. And he was instrumental in the progress of this case. So right after Lily died, Susan was arrested. She was arrested immediately and taken to the police station for interrogation. Lucy Lily's older sister, was immediately removed from the home. And eventually she ended up in the care of a cousin. So at least she stayed in the family. But Susan then was interviewed or interrogated by the detective for hours. Early on, she denied doing anything to her child. She never hurt her child. She never beat her child. She did not abuse her child. She denied abusing her child. After hours of questioning, interrogation, with no water, no food, and no bathroom breaks, Susan finally said, well, it was a stressful day. The baby had been sick for days. Maybe when I was changing her diaper, I pushed her down a little hard. That was it. And so right there, she caused the head trauma, and she went to trial. The first attorney did have legal nurse consultants on the case. They reviewed the medical records, the reports, and they determined that there was something metabolically different with this child. It seemed maybe she had diabetes or some metabolic condition that did not allow her to utilize the formula appropriately. And looking at growth charts that the legal nurse consultants developed, the child basically stopped growing around 6 months. She never met her 10-month or 6-month developmental goals of being able to sit on her own, crawl, stand, be verbal, and engaged with her environment. That never came out. That first attorney used those nurses, but did not use the information that they provided to him. The other thing was that the attorney never asked for the actual imaging of any of the body parts, the head, the lungs, any of the CT scans or x-rays. So they only went based on the reports. In the original trial, it was not a jury trial. It's what's called a bench trial. So the information was only given to the judge, and the judge was the sole person at the end of the trial, after all the testimony and everything. The judge was the person who made the decision that she would be convicted of murder and sentenced to prison. So there were a few flaws with that first trial that we recognized when we did our PCR workup. So,
was there any investigation, Jean, in terms of the bruising, like looking at clotting factors in the blood work, for example? Before we continue with the show, I'd like to share this special announcement with you. Attorneys, like most people, like to be entertained while they learn. With a little imagination, you can deliver a lively and memorable presentation like this one. I'm Pat Iyer, and I've written hundreds of expert fact witness reports. My most successful program occurred when my client and I did a role play in front of an audience of about 30 plaintiff attorneys. Here's how it came about. My client represented a woman who was hit by a bus when she was returning from gambling in Atlantic City. She incurred extensive injuries from which she recovered. When the defense attorney took her deposition, she consistently downplayed the impact of the injuries on her life. The attorney came to me to provide him with an expert fact witness summary of her medical records. The defense increased the size of their offer from $200,000 to $1 million after they saw the summary. At the beginning of our 10-minute segment, I put on a scarf to cue the audience that I was playing the plaintiff. The attorney and I read brief segments of her depositions during the time when she minimized her injuries. Then I turned to the audience and said, Gary called me and said, Pat, we have a problem. The audience roared in laughter. I then explained the role of the expert fact witness in summarizing injuries and treatment. When I stepped down, I had a line of attorneys waiting to ask for my card. That one presentation resulted in $200,000 in income. You'll find other examples of engaging presentations in my book, Powerful LNC Presentations, How to Get the Case. Get your copy today at lnc.tips/creating series. Now let's return to the show.
Thank you for asking. Yes, she had coagulopathy. Lily had coagulopathy, and she was anemic. Her protein and albumin were low, and her liver enzyme were elevated. Some of these results, and her white count was normal. So some of these results can be explained, like the elevated liver enzymes could be explained because she was ill. But the protein and the albumin were never investigated. The bruising was all assumed to be caused by Susan. But as we know, we nurses know that healthcare in the ICU, especially resuscitation, even in the field with the EMS, is brutal. And this kid had been sick, right? So was she septic? And with sepsis comes along coagulopathy. Almost all of the bruises that she had on her body when we were investigating this could be explained by healthcare. The bruises about her, well, there was that one bruise on her head probably caused when she fell out of bed. And I'll talk about experts in just a minute. The experts are just outstandingly, it was such a gift to work with these experts. But so all of the bruises we could explain that she had a bruise on her left leg, her left lower leg. Well, it probably was from EMS holding her while they were trying to put the interosseous access into, while they were trying to put the needle into her bone. The bruises on her chest could have been from doing CPR. She had a bruise someplace on her face besides the head bruise from bonking her head. So probably that could be explained from the bag valve mask. And then also some of the bruises toward the back and near her ears could also be explained by somebody holding her head while they were bagging her or trying to intubate her. So all the bruises could be explained. So let's move on to experts. So one of the things that a legal nurse consultant does in a case is to, once we're, can I back up for a second to medical records? Medical records obviously are so important to the case. So when I got involved, I was looking for the imaging and I said, oh, okay, we need to get that. Now, Susan was convicted and her child died in 2004. By the time I got involved, it was 2017. Normally, those imaging would not be available because in 2004 in Arizona, this particular hospital had not digitized, easy for me to say, any of the imaging. So stuff was not on the computer and easily accessed. But somehow, for some reason, serendipity, those films were available. So I went to the hospital and picked them up. And that was one thing. There was also an autopsy, which I didn't talk about the autopsy, but the autopsy concluded that Lily died of blunt force head trauma, and the manner of death was homicide. The autopsy pictures were so useful for our case, but the medical examiner also did not investigate anything that was out of the ordinary, just stayed with the idea of blunt force trauma. And that was that for their determination. So in gathering the medical records, by the time I got involved, the attorneys had gotten most of them, but they did not recognize the importance of seeing the actual imaging. So in legal nurse consultant, when we're reviewing records, we see things right away. Immediately, I looked at the records and said, there's something metabolic with this child. She is not using the nutrition correctly. And she stopped growing, and no one had documented or recognized that except the nurses in the first case that weren't heard. So the attorneys were happy with that revelation, that there was something different about this child. The other thing I did was ask for family photos. I was having a hard time trying to reconcile what was in the medical records with something that seemed like a normal child. So looking at the pictures, it was very interesting that she was extremely small. She never was sitting on her own. She was always propped or being held. When you looked at her face and eyes, they were not engaged at all. They weren't looking at the camera. They weren't looking at the person holding them or anything. She had a kind of a startled look on her face. And she held one arm with the hand in the fist formation and held it kind of close in on her chest, and the other arm just sat outward. So she was very different. So in thinking about experts, one of the first experts we needed to think about was a pediatric neuropathologist to look at the pathology in the brain. Was there anything going on, because she looked so different? Was there anything looking in her head that was extremely different? One of the things when someone is without oxygen, the brain dies. When the brain dies, it swells. And with that swelling, there are little bridge vessels, bridge veins, that go between the layers of the dura, the covering of the brain. When those vessels are stretched, they bleed, they break and bleed. So she had a subdural hematoma. Was that from falling out of the bed? Was it from being beaten? Or was it from the brain swelling and those vessels being broken? The other question was there some kind of anomaly in her brain, maybe from birth trauma? Remember, the kid had meconium stained amniotic fluid. Well, that's unusual. That shows that maybe the baby was stressed during labor and delivery. That was never explored. What were the possibilities of that? What role did mom's chronic anemia play in the development of this fetus? So the pediatric neuropathologist looked at those kinds of issues that would impact the brain, possibly impact her brain. And why did she stop growing? She continued to be proportionate, but her head did not grow. She did not gain weight. She did not gain length. after somewhere around 6 months. And she certainly didn't progress intellectually or physically. The other thing that Mom said during one of the interviews was that she noticed that she was changing Lily's diaper more frequently in February. So was she diabetic and nobody noticed? Remember, this family was quite unsophisticated, and Susan did not get Lily to all of the needed well baby appointments in her first year of life. Perhaps had she gone to consistent appointments with a knowledgeable pediatrician, these things would have been picked up. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And the ER doctor that she saw in October didn't pick things up either. I don't think, well, anyway, he didn't pick things up. So the other expert that was important to us was the radiologist. So we hired a pediatric neuroradiologist to look at, also look at the imaging and the reports and verify to us that there was no skull fracture and there were no bodily fractures at all. Also, interestingly, on autopsy, the medical examiner also documented no fractures at all, including in the skull. The medical examiner also documented that widened suture line as a widened suture, not as a fracture. So we had those two experts were instrumental. We also, because of the question of metabolic issues, we sought out a pediatric geneticist. And on autopsy, most often fluids are saved for later analysis for these kinds of questions or whatever comes up. And so there was blood available to send to our geneticist for analysis for genetic issues. We also needed blood from Mom, and that was easy. She was in prison. She was kind of a captive audience. So we were able to go get blood from her. And then they needed blood from Dad. Well, Dad was in a different prison, and it was a remote prison in Arizona, and there was no phlebotomist to go and get the blood. So I was elected to go to his prison and get blood from him, and he was more than cooperative. It was wonderful that we were able to do that. So we sent all those blood samples to the geneticist, and he concluded that there were metabolic anomalies that predisposed Lily to respiratory conditions, and that she, based on all of the information that he had, we gave him all the medical records that we had, plus the blood samples. And he concluded that she probably, if she didn't have a respiratory arrest that day, that it would happen fairly soon, that she was destined to have a respiratory arrest, which was also extremely sad, but fascinating. So one of the other experts that the attorneys hired was an interrogation expert. And that person looked at all of the interviews of Susan, and he also looked at some of the other interviews in other cases that this detective that was involved with Susan's case that he had conducted. And our interrogation expert determined that Susan experienced psychological coercion by this detective, and that her confession could not necessarily be truthful and valid. So that was something that I had not experienced before, and that was very interesting. So,
And I think at this point, we need to wrap up and talk about the outcome of this case. I know that you said that she was released. Was there a second trial that was involved with providing this additional evidence?
we had the post-conviction trial. So yes, our trial was a 2-week trial presenting evidence. In a post-conviction relief trial, the attorneys are tasked with presenting new evidence that could possibly alter the sentence. So they offered the new evidence of looking at the imaging. The neurosurgeon in the first trial got on the stand and would not alter his determination that there was a skull fracture. So in the second jury, and we had a jury on the second trial also, which was, no, I'm sorry, we did not. We had just a bench trial again because we had to follow what had happened before, the process that had happened before. So, and the other expert that we had was a biomechanic engineer expert talking about the incidence of shortfalls and the impact of shortfalls on infants. And it was very interesting to listen to his testimony also. So our experts spoke, and I know I'm moving away from the question. So the second trial, yes, so her original conviction of murder was dismissed, but she was accused and found guilty of neglect because she did not recognize, or she neglected to take her child to regular health care and get early intervention for the second respiratory infection. So she was found guilty of a lesser manslaughter. She was allowed to get out of prison, and she's on parole. She got out of prison 2 years ago. So what's that? Well, it's almost 3 years now. It was 2020, the summer of 2020. She's doing very well. I get emotional. I still talk to her. I go out to lunch with her. She's gotten an apartment on her own. She cannot have responsibility for any children ever again. So she can never think about getting pregnant again. She is, when she was released from prison, she was 36, I guess. Yeah, 2 years ago, 36. And so she's still of reproductive age, but she does see her daughter once in a while. And she's got a job. She has a savings account. We don't think about the social support that someone getting out of prison needs. They don't, in Arizona, when someone gets out of prison, if there isn't a mechanism of support established by someone like their attorney, Susan lucked out with having one of the most special attorneys who pays attention to that kind of support after prison. She never would have survived. So in Arizona, prisoners are released with no money unless somebody has made a savings account for them. They have the clothes that they went into the prison with are the clothes that they get when they go out. And luckily, even though Susan's family is not sophisticated and not able to really support her, they love her and they're around. but the network that was established by Susan's attorney to make her successful is very strong, and she's doing beautifully. It's wonderful.
That is a wonderful story, Jean. And it's fascinating how you, as the legal nurse consultant, got an opportunity to intervene, to educate the attorney, to suggest avenues to explore. I'm sure you worked with the experts who looked at this case and helped the attorney understand the implications of the experts' conclusions. And in the end, was able to bring justice to Susan and help get her out of a prison into being able to live in society again.
Yes, it feels good.
I'm sure it does. I know that our viewer or our listener will be interested in finding out how to connect with you, to find out more about you and your services. What would be the best way for them to do that?
Anyone can email me at jean.cooper4997 Jean is spelled Jean .cooper, COOPER 4997 @gmail.com. My website is jeankcooperlnc.com. Jean K. Cooper LNC is all one word. You can even call me if you want to. My phone number is 602-616-9855. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jean. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
And if you are not aware of the opportunity to get transcripts for our podcasts, you may request them at podcast.legalnursebusiness.com. We also have just released a whole series of bundles of our best, most downloaded podcasts for the year 2022. You can select among 6 different types of bundles. Those are completely free. We've picked the top 4 podcasts in each of the 6 categories. And you can also select your bundles at podcast.legalnursebusiness.com. Thanks so much, and we will see you on the next show. This is Pat Iyer with Legal Nurse Podcast. You have just heard one of our outstanding guests, and coming up next, another outstanding guest. Dr. Michael Zima is a cardiologist. He's board certified in both cardiology and in pharmacology, and has reviewed cases and serves people as an expert witness. We've had a chat over a number of topics in this podcast. What are some of the key points that we were discussing, Michael?
And I think we took a look at how to deal with the boredom of reviewing voluminous medical records, the copy and paste function, what the good, the bad, and the ugly of copy and paste, why it's important to pay attention to detail when reviewing a medical record, so you can find that little chink in the armor of the other position. I think we also spent some time on pharmacology and drug interactions, the importance of drugs and their use and proper and improper use in reviewing a record, to make sure that if you're using that as a defense, that you looked at contemporaneous use of that drug and not used that may have been outdated, and how we approach a case. Do we approach it differently if we're a witness for the plaintiff as opposed to the defense? What are the differences? What are the similarities in our approach?
All right. Thank you so much. I know that you're going to get a lot from this podcast. Be sure to come back next week, or click on down below, or click on above, depending upon where you are watching this show or listening to this show, and get the benefit of Dr. Michael Zima's tips as a cardiologist and a person board certified in pharmacology on some of the nuances of being an expert in what can be a really challenging role. And it's not for everyone, but it is for the people who are analytical and detail-oriented and have got great communication skills and are willing to take a position and defend an opinion. Check out his podcast next, and thanks so much for being a watcher of Legal Nurse Podcast.